No, it was.
All right, good afternoon.
From Michael.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for bearing with me and coming to my 4:30 session. I really love doing these sessions with my technical team and giving them a chance to tell people about all of their work that they're doing and the details of the technologies that they're excited about and what's not working so well for them and so forth. Unfortunately, we are a little bit understaffed at the moment. We're down 2 positions we're hiring, and the 2 people who are currently on our engineering team were not able to attend. So you've got me. I'm Sarah Frug from the Legal Information Institute at Cornell Law School. Back there in the peanut gallery is our director, Tom Bruce. And I wanted to give this group an overview of what our general approach is right now, especially given that we are more resource constrained than we've been in a while, and how we are trying to solve that problem in order to continue to innovate in our development as the government proceeds to advance its technology agenda and release better and better versions of primary legal documents, which for a very long time have been something that was, if not uniquely available from us as republishers for free, then frequently not available in a very usable way, except at our site. So that said, a little bit more about who we are. I understand that there are a lot of reference librarians in the room and that many of you have used the LII site, so I probably don't have to say too much about this. At LII, we like to say that we use technology to help people find and understand the law. We are working particularly on understanding. Their retrieval is far more advanced than it was back in the day, and we find that nonetheless, a lot of the law is pretty confusing for possibly some very well understood reasons and probably some not as well understood reasons. The misleading view, and I think that this is something that is probably very familiar from the research librarian perspective, is that the LII website and the services that we offer through the website are available in this way to people, and you would come to the homepage and you would find the resource that you wish to explore, and you would navigate throughout the website in order to find that resource, and then you would read it, and then perhaps you would understand it or perhaps you wouldn't. You might use other supplementary resources to improve your understanding, and then you might be on your merry way going into something in a little bit more depth. I call this a misleading view because, at least according to our analytics, almost nobody uses the website this way. From the point of view of our audience, most of the time, this is what they see when they are approaching our website. And if they make it past all of the info boxes and the question and answer format and so forth, they might make it down to the very bottom over here and end up on one of our web pages. They might end up on CFR, they might end up on this employment law page, and our approach tends to be that when somebody has done a search on Google, they are most likely to end up in the wrong place. Now, that's a very broad generalization. There are many classes of users of LII. You might think of people who are attorneys or law students who have a pretty good idea of what they're looking for, and might have a very well-defined need to look up a specific paragraph within the United States Code or a particular section within the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. They do a Google search, they hop onto our site, they see what the answer is to their question, and then they're on their merry way. There are an awful lot of people at the other end of the spectrum who have some episodic traumatic problem that might or might not be addressable by landing on a particular page on the website. If they happen to end up on some of the original content on the website, they might be a little bit luckier than if they end up in some random section of the Code of Federal Regulations that happens to share some vocabulary with the search query that they typed into the search engine. But while we are taking those audience members into account when we do our feature development and when we try to design the way that we present information in order to redirect them from where they probably oughtn't to be to where they might be more likely to have a fruitful research experience. We are also preoccupied with a very large category in the middle of people who work with particularly federal legal materials, who are working in a professional context and probably are fairly well acquainted with the material that they are looking for, and yet might not have all of the context that they need in order to understand what they're doing. So, some very round numbers. I believe this is about a month's worth. The most commonly used resources on the site at the moment are Code of Federal Regulations, United States Code. The rules section is for all of the federal rules, including civil procedure, criminal procedure, evidence, appellate procedure, bankruptcy procedure. And I think that actually the Supreme Court rules falls under that category. WEX is original content that is created by legal academics, law students, under the supervision of my counterpart, who is not currently here, might be here later on, Craig Newton. We also have a bunch of other sections of the site that are very heavily used, and what I was really quite surprised to discover, because this is the first time I've checked in the last few months, is that the number of people who come to read definitions on the website now exceeds the number of people who come to read the Constitution, which was certainly not the case as of a few years ago. The definition feature is quite new. So back in the day, we had a lot of primary content. We had some very, I would say, very general secondary original content that was anchoring a lot of the website and helping to direct people to primary resources that they might be interested in. And nowadays, not only do we have a lot of a different orientation toward how we develop our content, but we also are pulling in a great deal more content from other locations. So we call this the big tent. This is a picture of a big tent. There were not so many other pictures of big tents that were not for circuses, and I don't really want to characterize this as being like a circus. So this is what we ended up with, is our construction site here. So, approaches and constraints. And I am not going to be super specific on this. I'm really happy to answer technical questions. I can cite chapter and verse on quite a lot of what we have been doing, what we are aiming to do in the future, and where we have run into roadblocks. But especially because many of the people in this audience are research librarians, I am going to try to focus at a little bit of a higher level and give some information in general about what kinds of thorny problems we tend to run into. So because a lot of the people in this room are research librarians, you may not be familiar with this diagram. For anyone who's done software development, it's probably fairly familiar. This is a classic waterfall development process. This is not what we do. Has never really been what we do. The closest we've ever come, I think, is occasionally on a student project there has been something that sort of resembled this. But most of the time we are, sorry? Most of the time we are trying to do something that is more iterative, these diagrams tend to get labeled with Agile. That is not an ideology as far as I'm concerned. It is merely a little bit of a different way of thinking about how we go about thinking about what we might do and evaluating which pieces of it we've done and whether they're any good and whether further work is really worth pursuing. So in terms of constraints, we have, as I mentioned, 2 people fewer than we usually do, and we have had 2 people fewer than we usually do for just about a year at this point. And we have not exactly been in this situation of the question mark leading to good code, because I think that all of this and the cartoons to follow, I think, are still all in the mode of having a single project and not really attempting to develop anything new while dodging baseballs. And I know that there is a presentation scheduled for Cali that is going to be on the subject of technical debt, and I realize that this is fairly closely aligned with that. So let's just think of this as being something that is maybe having a little bit of a different or quirky take on that. So it's difficult to both write good software and get things done quickly, and the trade-offs, as in the prior cartoon, can be a little bit thorny, and neither approach is any guarantee of actually ending up with something that is useful and workable. It is very difficult, if you look at this one, to estimate what's going to be easy and what's going to be hard. We have a lot better idea at this point of what is hard than we did maybe 5-6 years ago, but I think that it is still nonetheless quite complicated for us to be confident of what things are going to be easy. And you may laugh at me later on in this presentation because I am going to put forward a couple of ideas about approaches that we're taking in order to try to pick off some of the more manageable tasks. So I'll hold that. And then just for your entertainment, a third example of how we are sometimes bogging down in getting ahead of ourselves or trying to be a little bit too clever. We don't always want to take the approach of making the homework machine that takes longer to make than it does to do the actual homework. And from a completely different perspective, I was wincing a few minutes ago when there were a couple of mentions of Drupal. This was from 2014. There was a blog post from 18F, which is the innovation service in GSA, and I found it to be very heartening because, of course, no one has legacy software that they really cannot do much about more than the federal government does. And this was really, in many ways, very reassuring of the general approach that we were thinking about, and again, very heartening because the writers were addressing head-on that sometimes there is software, there is a service that is completely unworkable to interact with on a day-to-day basis from the point of view of developing features for a user base, and nonetheless really has to stay put, and you need to address the question of how are you going to get your data. So at this point, a couple of case studies. And I wanted to walk through what are we thinking about as we look at, under the subject of the big tent, what are we contemplating? What about the offerings that we currently have is relevant to projects that we take on? And how are we refining our development process in order to make it possible to keep up with what we have to keep up with while at the same time not making it impossible to maintain over the long term services that we already have to maintain, new services that we will have to maintain if we take on this project. And the first example of this is from a couple years back that we adopted it at this point. However, it has actually very much under the radar been a little bit of a success story for iterative development in our shop, because we have in real life, despite having quite a bit of difficulty keeping up with all of the maintenance work that we have to do, been able to maintain it and are reasonably confident that we're going to be able to maintain it for the longer term. And that is after having had two fairly similar projects in the past that just proved to be unmaintainable. So Rio is a citation resolver. It offers multiple points of resolution, so you can enter a citation. There are several classes of citations that it handles, and for each class of citation it will point to both free and openly available resources as well as commercial resources. The software was originally commissioned by Peter Martin, who has done enormous amounts of work, as I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with, on legal citation, on teaching how legal citation works to generations of law students and paralegals. And he commissioned a software developer, Alex Bertel, to develop this citation resolver. Now, in the original version, it was very case law oriented, and it was designed to resolve a couple of classes of resources that were of interest to LII, because LII is better known for publishing United States Code and Code of Federal Regulations, but it was really intended to aid in the process of making it possible to create choice of viewing citation resolution that would make it possible for not only people who needed to retrieve a case from a legal citation to retrieve that case, but also a very special use case where there are jurisdictions where certain types of links are required, so links to certain commercial databases are required, and this service was intended to make it possible to generate a link to a commercial service without oneself having access to that commercial service. And so that was intended to make it a lot easier for people to fulfill their requirements for filing without having to pay for something that they didn't actually need. So our first step when we inherited this project was to ask the question, what are the classes of citations that we don't have yet? What can we link to? And from our perspective, the big headlines were statutes at large, public law citations, and Federal Register. And so we went about adding, just looking for, and you'll see here that each of the classes of citation has different endpoints for resolution. We went about analyzing the endpoints and developing software that would enable resolution for customized to those particular endpoints. Now, in the middle of this process, the federal digital system added additional endpoints, and so we did a second round of development to make adjustments so that we could get resolution to up-to-date endpoints, and as well as destinations that had better capabilities in them. And so that was really round two. Round three was thinking about what are the classes of both citations, which we had done a pretty good job on, but also what are the classes of destinations for the for the resolver to point to, and so those both on a conceptual level and on a technical level came with some quirks, and so there was a certain amount of development that was associated with just making sure that we were developing the software in a way that would make it more maintainable over the long term, so that we could hand the existing application to a brand new developer and say, okay, this week we need to add citation resolution for a first page, or this week we need to add citation resolution to this resource in the Library of Congress, which has just been made available. Those are two examples that we actually ended up completing. And because we took the time to put some additional thought into how to design the software so that it was easier to address those two very common use cases, we have been able to keep up. This next one, which I inadvertently previewed just a second ago, is just the notification that the federal digital system and the API links are going to be retired in December of 2018. And so what that means is that now we have yet another round of development to make sure that the resolvers at the other end of those API links actually continue to work in the same way, and that we have made sure to switch everything over so that they point at the new destination. And so that is sort of the that is the cosmic joke that happens to us every time we do our job correctly. It's quite possible that someone else will come in and say, "Ha! You thought you were done, but really not, because we're improving our services, and now there's something better, and this old thing, you don't want it anymore." So, any questions so far? Okay, all right. Next up, and I am going to just recall the slide from a little while back, which was the Google search results view of how people end up at the website, because I think it's particularly important for this next one. The Women in Justice collection was developed at Cornell Law School by a center that was developed particularly for the purpose of providing judicial training. And as part of this mission, they developed a repository of case law, or links to case law, and summaries of case law, and a couple of other classes of resources that they put together in a collection and put on the Cornell Law School website. We did not have, although I believe there were one or two discussions where we talked to the people who were running the project and developing the software initially. We were not involved in the development of the project, not involved certainly in any aspect of the development of the original software, and so we really had very little idea of how it worked. Fast forward, the project evolved. The desire to have a case law repository focused on the subject of women in justice was deprecated, for lack of a better way to put it, and we were asked to take over maintenance of the case law repository. And so this is just a screenshot from what was originally available on the law school's website. They had a faceted search application, If you drill down a little bit, you can see that they were organizing the information in a fairly systematic way, and you could explore the collection by browsing from a number of starting points and drill down and find what you were looking at. My understanding was that for people who use the resource fairly intensively, the search application was the most used. At the time that we adopted the project, we believed that there was a faceted search application backing every single page in the website. And what we discovered was that, in fact, although all of these resources were represented in the database in one way or another, this was not across the board a database-backed application or the search engine-backed application. In many areas, what you would see would be things that looked like they had been retrieved from a search engine and yet had in fact been hard-coded into individual web pages. And so what we decided that we needed to do was to make sure that step one, that we could continue to maintain the content, because the single best resource that we had available was a network of writers and editors who were volunteering their time to update the case law collection and add new records. Now, in that process, we encountered a big, well, for lack of a better way to put it, asteroid strike, when suddenly the entire legacy website disappeared overnight. And we discovered that behind the scenes, without our knowing about it, someone had been told to turn it off, and the way that it had been turned off was to delete the whole thing. And so we were suddenly in a very big hurry to make sure that everything was being migrated ahead of the schedule that we had set out for migration and redirection and public handover of the project. And so we ended up going back to the content management system that we had been using, which is Drupal and Drupal 7, and we ginned up in very short order an interface for the writers and editors to be able to use in order to enter both the text that they wanted to enter, which represented the summaries of all of the case law that they were producing, but also quite a bit of customized metadata, including document type, because the collection contained not only domestic case law, but also international case law and some legislation, some regulations or directives, some reports from the legacy project that had been original content that had been entered into the system, and a couple of other document types. There was a controlled vocabulary, which were the topics. There was a free tagging vocabulary for keywords. It turned out that the reason for the free tagging vocabulary for keywords was not that there was a problem with the controlled vocabulary, but that the legacy implementation did not have any full text searching, and so the only way to get a term into full text search was to enter keywords. And so there were these other metadata fields. The court, fairly straightforward. Jurisdiction, hopefully also straightforward. Geographical location, a little bit of a mess. And all of these things had to be analyzed and resolved. And so there were a couple of places where we decided that we needed to alter the data model. We decided to, for most of the metadata, to leave the data model intact for the first release. The one exception to that was geographical location, where geographical location had been implemented as a set of independent fields, and we decided to make a polyhierarchical vocabulary so that it was possible to assign countries to the regions that the authors felt was appropriate to assign them to, but not to assign countries to regions that they had no business being assigned to. So Colombia doesn't belong in Australasia, for example. So having done all of that and migrated all of the data, we then started to look at the question of what it was going to look like after we had done the initial emergency implementation of replicating the feature set that had existed in the prior collection so that we could redirect it, and looking down the road to see what can we do to improve the user experience for this collection, what can we do to enhance the discoverability of these resources, because the collection was very labor intensive to develop, and we're very fortunate that we have some good SEO and people come to the LII website to read about topics like employment law or divorce or any number of other topics. And if we built up this collection focused on women and justice and didn't implement any kind of strategy for making sure that people who ended up, once again, in the place where they didn't want to be could be sent over to the place where they might be more likely to want to be, then we would be wasting quite a bit of work, we thought. And so we had a number of challenges to address. We looked at where the data model might be improved. We looked at where the metadata quality needed to be improved. Having looked at all of the metadata, we went back and we looked at whether everything in the data model was really necessary to begin with. We discovered that, for instance, as between jurisdiction and geographical location and court, the same information could be entered into really any two of those three fields at any point, and we wondered whether there was perhaps a better way to model the data that would be supportive of greater quality of metadata and greater usability from the point of view of editors, let alone from the view of audience and users, readers of the collection. And so we mashed all of that stuff together, and we now have a very big backlog. And we have really just gotten to the point where we're able to take in all of the documents, all of the metadata. We have the links. We're able to then support search. And then what we are offering in the search application is far less than all of the metadata that we're collecting. We are focusing on making it easy to retrieve by country or region of the world, easy to retrieve by browsing topics, and easy to retrieve by selecting a time period or a document type, or really probably not, sorry to step back a second, document type, time period, but really not yet using some of the metadata fields where the metadata quality was so low that we thought that it would be more confusing. And so for those, what we ended up doing was simply collapsing that and putting that metadata back into the full text search so people could retrieve it that way. And that's where we've rested. We haven't yet done a product launch for this. We are still working out many of the kinks. This was completed or made public, some of it prematurely, because of the situation with the legacy site being unavailable or not being maintained. And so this was probably the best example of where we went in and we decided, here is a list of compromises that we're going to have to make. Is it possible for us to do something that is yet of value to the public? And if so, how can we do it in the way that we think is most responsible? So, questions on that? All right. Third up, and this is the last case study. This is the most speculative. We are really in the middle of actively developing on semantic web features. Who's worked with semantic web technologies in this room? Okay. So one way to think about what we're doing is really just a big data integration project where we've gone out and we have learned how to work with a very large number of structured vocabularies, and we are trying to think of ways to work so that we are able to bring the results of all of this work to the public in a more expedited way without at the same time generating yet another large mass of technical debt that we're going to have to resolve later. And so I'll start by giving, and this is verbatim, a slide from a presentation that I did at Cali last year on another project, which put forth a couple of very big questions about how we might use semantic web technologies to answer some really pretty interesting legal research questions, like how do definitions make their way from statutes into rules? How does the presence of particular entities correlate with comment activity from particular industries, and which entities not mentioned in a proposed rule end up appearing in comments and rulemakings? Now, I am ratting myself out here because these are all questions that take quite a lot of work to be able to answer, even given how much metadata we have available. And we are, at this point, stepping back from thinking big about these big kinds of questions and focusing instead on looking at little building blocks. So we're thinking smaller. One example is that we invested quite a lot of resources in figuring out how to detect and parse and find scope for and locate terms in context for definitions in the United States Code and the Code of Federal Regulations. And instead of asking or trying to answer the question right this minute of how did the definitions make their way from the statutes into the rules, which involves quite a lot of very detailed work in order to make sure that every single piece of the data chain is working correctly, we thought, well, what happens if we start by doing a dictionary? And so we have a section of the Code of Federal Regulation that deals with animals. It has a definition of animal. And what are all the definitions of animal in the Code of Federal Regulations? What are all the definitions of animal in the United States Code? And that is probably, in this room, maybe the least interesting question for a definition that you could probably think of. In the outside world, it's probably much, much, much more interesting because you need to know whether your livestock needs to be alive in order to count as livestock or whether it might be able to be dead, and a million other questions like that. We have, in the process of prototyping, dealt with, and this is a very, very, very long list of classes of entities that have their own knowledge bases that might involve entities that people are interested in. So analogous to what happens if we take all of this work that we did to extract definitions and resolve defined terms in the US Code and the CFR, and we turned it into a dictionary, which is a fairly simple process for us, but makes it possible for end users to retrieve a lot more information in a much richer way. What happens if we take a pharmaceutical-oriented look at what is out there in the law? And same thing with plants and animals and medical entities. We have done some work with product and industry codes, and this might be a little bit controversial in this room, but also getting entities out of Wikipedia in a machine readable format, and supporting retrieval from the point of view of the entity. We know at this point how to get this from the structure of the Code of Federal Regulations to information about federal agencies, and that supports an agency-centric retrieval. We know how to get from the thesaurus of indexing terms. Who in this room has used that at all? No. So the Office of the Federal Register publishes a thesaurus of indexing terms for the Code of Federal Regulations, and those are mapped to parts of the Code of Federal Regulations. And so we have topical retrieval, which it turns out is pretty convenient because it makes it a lot easier for us to disambiguate and map to external vocabularies and knowledge bases. And so combining the indexing terms from the Federal Register thesaurus with legislative subjects can facilitate getting from statutes to regulations in a different way from the classic methods of using tables of authorities. We can get from the Federal Register thesaurus fairly easily to these vocabularies like agrovoc, which contains agricultural concepts that can let us get to scientific research. And I will pause here if anyone has heard this piece of it before. Yes? No? Okay. We can get from agricultural context to this scientific research. There are these repositories of knowledge and knowledge bases that use the controlled vocabularies that are expressed in a machine readable way to classify all of the scholarship in their repositories, and that lets us go to other resources and retrieve more information that is associated with those same concepts. All right, I mentioned industry and product codes, and again, the point of this is that I have a starting point, and I know a lot about the ways in which people show up in the Code of Federal Regulations, and the question is, how can I map to all of the other things that people who are interested in these regulations might be interested in knowing or need to know. So, in conclusion, we are thinking a lot smaller on a day-to-day basis about what is, for maybe one way to put it, what is a viable product that might be useful to somebody, what helps people get from where they are right now, where they landed on our website, to the next piece of information that might be useful to them. We are focusing in terms of our technical approach on having really strong control over metadata, over the quality of our texts. And in some respects, we are isolating that and working on very lightweight feature development techniques that will enable us to reuse that same very high quality metadata that we're machine generating and the very high quality text work that we've been able to do when we are at the point where we have more hands to bring to bear on the challenge of engaging with the users and figuring out what we can put in front of them and how we can get information back from them about what they need to know, and how we can better provide that to them. So, questions? No questions at all. Okay, but so yeah.
So I was just kind of curious, given the improvement of governments rightly publishing their own primary sources, as we should have, any thought about tackling some of the second, the value-added editorial things like a citator? So, I mean, I don't know where Joe Schmo goes to use a citator for like Supreme Court cases. But it strikes me as that that would be analytical. It could be done with your full-text resources, and would be a great service to the public in a non-commercial way. Any thought about? I mean,
There are really two pieces to that, right? One is so when you talk about a citator, there are a couple of approaches to doing that, and so my colleague Craig Newton has just walked in. He masterminds all of the original content for the LII, and so there is a piece of the endeavor of citator that would be about original content and integrating original content. We tend to look at the law from the bottom up, and so we tend to start from things and concepts in the world and try to see how those intersect with the law. So what is the law of pseudoephedrine? Well, pseudoephedrine it's a pharmaceutical, it's manufactured, it is regulated the way that all pharmaceutical manufacturing is regulated. It's a precursor to methamphetamine, and so there are drug enforcement regimes around that. And there is statutory authority for all of this above that. And at some point, it probably ends up in case law, but that's a little bit far afield. And so there are, I mean, yes, we have thought about it. We've thought about doing citators. I think good citators require comprehensive repositories case law. Those will be available. Forward-looking, there are some pretty good open repositories of case law right now. Backward-looking, there are some really excellent comprehensive repositories of case law that will be publicly available in a couple of years. And so even if that were what we thought was most valuable to our audience, which again is fairly heavily skewed toward people who are in industry, whether they are practicing law in industry or whether they're trying to do business in a regulated industry, which is everywhere. And so for the most part, we haven't yet seen that a citator is what there's the strongest need for. Yes.
Regarding the Women and Justice case study.
Yes.
I'm curious to hear more about what goes into the decision-making about how to focus on a project like that, and how you're going to measure a successful outcome.
Sure.
And have that understanding that what you're hoping will satisfy the user needs is in fact satisfying user needs and being used in a way that justifies the effort you're putting into it.
Sure thing. And I'm going to invite Craig to comment on that because he's supervising all the substantive work of the project, which is actually the creation of the original content.
Yeah, I don't know how much you said about its origin.
It was explained that it was a project that we inherited.
You probably didn't explain that the professor that was the original head of the center is married to the dean of the law school, which certainly factored into decision-making in taking up the project. Or that the first fellow of the center was one of my best friends in law school, which probably also factored into decision-making to take on the project. So those were the sort of, soft metrics, I guess. And so, there were some politics involved. It's probably the easiest way to say that. Honestly, though, it's when we found out fairly quickly that we had at our disposal a very qualified and fairly inexpensive graduate of the law school that would run it for us as a part-time labor of love, and the technical challenges seemed fairly lightweight, at least initially, to just sort of replicate the database from where it had been living to where it needed to live. It seemed like something, and it was obviously, from an impact standpoint in terms of the importance of the material, it just seemed like a sort of low-cost thing that we could do to be a good citizen of the law school and a good citizen of the world, and it wasn't going to take up a ton of Sarah's team's developer time. It wasn't going to take up a ton of my time. We have lawyers from 3 NLAW 100 law firms that are dedicating pro bono hours to actually populating the thing with cases. So again, they're doing the work, and we're building relationships there that are mutually beneficial. In terms of metrics, that's always a hard thing for us, and there's no good answer to say, was this worth it? Generally, when we start asking questions about whether it's worth it or not is when we start feeling a lot of pain in the doing of it. So far, that hasn't been the case.
But there, I would I would add that there's another way of looking at what is the benefit of doing a project like this. And so this was a chance to take a fresh crack at doing fairly structured collection of metadata from expert original content creators, and to see what it entailed to put one of these together, with the idea that what we built would be likely to be reusable. And it had been so many years since we did a metadata model for original content, right? The last time we did that was for the Supreme Court Bulletin, which was more than 10 years ago. And so that tends to factor in as well, where if we have something that seems worthwhile, that gives us the opportunity to try out something, then we tend to be more likely to take it, even if this particular project doesn't have huge take-up. I think the other thing about this project was that it was originally designed to be used by judges. And so if you talk about metrics on the LII website, it's 35 million people every year, and we wouldn't expect anything like a number of users that would even register for that. I think that what we would need to see would be feedback from people who use the resource.
Well, I'm not intending to ask about metrics specifically. I was thinking about success generally. Also,
another piece of that, not to beat a dead horse here, but a lot of the countries that have case law featured heavily in that database are countries that have fairly new LIIs in them. So there's another sort of long strategic play in getting those other LIIs involved in curating that content and making connections between, say, lawyers in the New York office of White and Case and courthouses in Kenya to try to just find the case law, right? And so those are going to be, success there may be anecdotal, but it may nevertheless be real. When we go to the international conferences and deal with the other LIIs, we have very different problems than they do. And so, not to sound in any way condescending, but in some ways, if we can get them past thinking of themselves as just a publisher of record or a quasi-publisher of record of law in their jurisdiction, which is no small feat, but begin to get them in the value-added secondary content game, get them in the content curation game above, trying to be comprehensive publishers, which again, no small feat, then that's a different kind of impact and a different kind of success that's perhaps maybe too attenuated to ever take credit for, much less measure. But definitely something, I think that was one of Tom's first instincts is, hey, we know people in all these countries, let's get them involved too. And sort of once we get our house in order on it, then that's down the road.
I want to talk in a very cynical program directory way about impact, because it really is a problem for us. It's a problem in terms of fundraising. It's a problem in terms of the kind of question that was just asked. You know, where do you look, right? I mean, I have been in a room with 20 senior Cornell fundraisers who were impressed as hell with a variety of clinical projects from around the law school, each of which could show a parade of photo ops of clearly disadvantaged people who were being helped in some way. Total population affected around 250. If, on the other hand, you look at what we're doing, we have tens of thousands of public service lawyers using a resource to help hundreds of thousands of clients. And if you look at those numbers, you think, well, that's a pretty big deal, but it has nowhere near the visceral impact that all of those photo ops do. So there really is a question of, well, how do you count and what kind of effect do you want to have in the world? And of course, we would like to do as much good as we possibly can. At the same time, we're very aware that 90% of the time, what we're doing is handing someone a tool to help someone else that we will never know, that we will never see. It's a little bit like that old story about the marketing class at the Harvard Business School, where the guy holds up an electric drill, then Black & Decker's leading product, and said, this is not what Black & Decker sells. Black & Decker sells quarter-inch holes. You know, the user doesn't care about the drill. They want a hole. And we very often, you know, we pass out drills, but we very seldom see the holes. It's a real issue.
Other questions?
So the vast majority of traffic originates on Google or at the site itself? I mean,
I think it's, Craig has been doing the
Yeah,
metrics, but it's about,
it's all
it's about,
organic search, not
yeah.
all organic search, but it's, yeah, it all comes through. It all comes through organic search, which is basically the same as saying Google, because Google is, what, 80% of all organic search? More or less. We could riff on that for another hour.
Yes, we could.
Given the opportunity. Stick around.
Sure.
On this line. It must obviously then be a challenge to try to integrate user feedback into the work that you're doing, right?
Mm-hmm. It is, but what we have found is that in the past we've gotten a lot of value out of user feedback that leads to implementation that is far less expensive than we thought it would be. So you should do a citator is amazing feedback, and the implementation cost would be quite hefty. But we have had on a number of occasions opportunity to show very specific work to focus groups of people who are practicing in the area. And I have an example when we were redoing our Code of Federal Regulations. Instead of just linking to pull in all of the text and add navigation and value-added features, we showed this to two groups of librarians from the federal government, and one of them looked at one of the tabs that we had on the CFR and said, that says Federal Register. What does that mean? Is that rulemaking? Is that current awareness? What is that? Is that authorities? What is that for? And we realized, oh, our tabs are labeled according to the data source and don't actually convey any useful information. And that was a change that required all of 15 minutes to implement end to end. So I am not discounting that people can have very expensive ideas, but by the same token, I would say that for the most part, we have found that we are able to make use of quite a lot more feedback than we might expect.
So, some years ago, Cornell decided to revise its internal policies on how it was assessing units for unrelated business income tax, the bane of all nonprofits. And in the process of reorganizing this, we met with a tax specialist that they'd hired. And at the conclusion of the meeting, the guy said, you know, I use your site all the time, but I've always been curious about something. Why don't you link to the IRS private letter rulings? And I couldn't think of a reason because, frankly, I had no idea what he was talking about. But once I went and took a look at it, I realized, yeah, you could actually do that quite easily. We put the feature together in a couple of days. It proved hugely popular with tax practitioners, but more to the point, every time I met with the guy thereafter, I'd give him the traffic statistics. And it was like this was his child. It ultimately resulted in quite a favorable agreement with the university as far as our tax status was concerned. So as far as I was concerned, it was an all-round win. But in all seriousness, there is a certain amount of stuff like that really does bubble up in very simple ways. And we haven't even talked yet about content correction and that sort of thing. I mean, there are people out there who spend their lives in 3 sections of the U.S. Code, and every time something happens with respect to that, they'll let you know, sometimes loudly.
I just want to be on the record as saying it scares the hell out of me that I immediately thought of that same story.
Yeah, it should.
That's why I was taking my question, so.
So we're past time. Thank you. I can't believe we got through the last.